And for the first time ever since they've released any of their position stands, a Canadian got to author it, and that was our group. So that was a pretty big deal.
You're like the Canadian astronaut that just went around
like
the moon.
that. But yeah, that was a pretty big deal. It hadn't been revised in 17 years, so there was obviously a lot of new stuff that needed to come out. And it really tried to emphasize that resistance training is not just for athletes and, it's for mere mortals, and it's part of a healthy aging plan, if you like, and trajectory.
There's a story that Dr. Stuart Phillips tells about the day he met Dr. Mark Tarnopolsky. Stu limped in on a broken leg. Mark was riding a stationary bike with a halo bolted to his skull after hitting a moose. That was 40 years ago. And if you know anything about either of them, you're not surprised. Stu went on to become one of the most influential muscle physiologists in the world. Over 400 publications, 33,000 citations, first Canadian to lead the American College of Sports Medicine's position stand on resistance training. But when you sit across from him, he doesn't talk about any of that. He talks about his students. He talks about John, a member of PACE, who kept showing up at age 103, not really to exercise, but to talk to people. Today, we're going to talk about muscle, protein, and the first principles of healthspan, dismantling the longevity illusion, and why the strongest thing that you can build might not be your body. Let's dive in. Dr. Stuart Phillips, actually known as Stu, is a distinguished university professor and Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Skeletal Muscle Health at McMaster University. He has spent nearly 4 decades studying how exercise and nutrition shape the tissue that powers human mobility, that is skeletal muscle. His research program has produced over 400 publications and some 33,000 citations, making him one of the most influential muscle physiologists in the world. As chair of the Department of Kinesiology and former director of the Physical Activity Center of Excellence, that's PACE for short, he led a community of 500 members, mostly seniors and individuals with chronic conditions, where cutting-edge research, student education, and the human experience of aging well converge. A fellow of both the American College of Sports Medicine and the Royal Society of Canada, Stu is as passionate about the stories of his PACE members as he is about the incredible students at his undergrads, graduate students, and research fellows that do the real work. So, Stu, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here. Your reputation precedes you. You were sent my way by Dr. Mark Tarnopolsky. So, like I said, happy, excited to be diving into all things muscle. Welcome.
Appreciate it.
The DNA of things.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show, Jeremy.
So, hey, why don't we start with the good news? Exciting announcement recently.
Yeah. So the American College of Sports Medicine, one of the largest societies in the world in terms of professional members dedicated to promoting, obviously, physical activity, not just for sport, but for mere mortals as well. They issue position stands on a number of different topics, but resistance training or weightlifting, whatever you want to call it, is one. We were proud to be the lead and senior authors on that. It was recently revised, just released about a month ago, and hadn't been revised in 17 years. So there was a lot to catch up on because resistance training is an area that the research has expanded tremendously. And so, real proud of that. Proud to see it getting a lot of airtime. I think the reaction is generally positive. And the ethos of what we had in there was really to show people that, we're getting pretty refined on the doses of this exercise that we need to have people do to improve not just their strength and power and everything, but their general health and mobility. And to try and convince people that, resistance training is not just for jocks in the gym, but for everyday folks. And it's probably a de rigueur part of aging well. So, yeah, pretty happy to get that out.
Yeah. And I think we'll get into some of your background history because I know you've got an athletic background and, as do I. And so to hear something like that, you're like, obviously, right? Because you're on the other side of sport. And, I think I personally, you feel the effects of not doing that work insofar as like the structural integrity, the general energy, like even cognition. And, there's this temptation when you're outside of organized sport, as use your words, no longer a jock. It's like, oh, let me just do what all the non-jocks do and let me do like a half marathon and not knocking the half marathon.
No.
Personally, hate it. Yeah. And it's just never really been something I've wanted to do. I've always innately gravitated to the sprints, the speed power. Like I did 60, 100, 200 was really pushing it, honestly. I think part of that was probably that I was like a kind of late bloomer. And so maybe I didn't get as much pace as I might have. But, I just noticed the thing about, strength training, resistance training is just the rapid gains that you got, which could be in the world of sport, like maybe something to be cautious on, given like the tendon and ligament adaptation lags. And that to me led to like downstream injury. But maybe it's worthwhile taking a step back because we have folks who listen who are, cutting edge researchers in the field, but also adjacent fields. So may not quite understand, the vernacular and the jargon that we're speaking to. And then, you've got users of the information and potential collaborators. But let's just back up. Like what is resistance training?
Yeah. So, I mean, we have a definition in the position stand, but it's basically the practice of something but with intention. It's not like physical activities that you do it as part of daily living can't, make you fitter or make you healthier, go for a walk. It doesn't always have to be with the intention of improving your fitness, but the intentional practice of resistance training is moving or trying to move an external load. The external load could just be your own body weight. We know full well that people who could do body weight exercises to the extreme or, you see lots of different athletes that are, particularly proficient in that regard, and they're not weak by any margin, but you obviously get people who lift weights. And so something external to their body, and generally something that you can only do somewhere between about, I would say, once being the maximum, you can only lift it once, to maybe about 25 to 30 times. After that, it's sort of seen that it begins to bleed over into the endurance side of things. So heavier things that challenge, your muscles, your tendon, your bone, et cetera.
I want to get into like some of the, I don't know, guess maybe the reinforcing factors that, make this kind of activity more, obvious, accessible, in comparison to like, hey, lacing up my shoes and going for a run.
Right.
Like, it's
Yeah.
just like, oh,
Yeah.
there's so much less friction there.
Yeah.
But maybe like, let's go into like a little bit about like your kind of story arc. Cause I mentioned I got introduced to you through Dr. Mark Tarnopolsky who I had on the show.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear your story because I remember when we chatted last time, I was like, our paths could have overlapped because McMaster was one of the universities I was looking at. And I lament that it wasn't, but, grateful that we're here, but interested to know how you got connected with Mark because he's done some pretty amazing stuff and how that led you to where you are.
Yeah. So I did my undergrad here at McMaster. I did it in biochemistry. At the time, there was no kinesiology. It was phys ed, which is the program Mark incidentally graduated from, because he was a runner. He was basically a jock. He was a smart jock though, and I was a jock too. I mean, I played rugby in undergrad. That was my sport. I played it until basically 2 weeks before my fourth year, and I broke my leg. And I was going to come back. I was going to be part of the varsity team. I was actually going to be the captain of the team. Couldn't play, and I kind of thought my life was over. Like young, stupid, didn't really know what life was about, but that seemed like a big deal at the time. As a result, I chose to do a senior thesis. I got in the lab, and the truth is that I was like, where have you been all my life? It was a bit of I wouldn't say it was an epiphany, but it was certainly an evolution of understanding that I really enjoyed learning. I really enjoyed research, really enjoyed discovery. Last year, I took a class in nutrition, and I was like, this is amazing. Spoke to the supervisor, a woman named Stephanie Atkinson, still a faculty member in pediatrics here at McMaster. And she said, I'm taking grad students because that's what I was interested in. And she said, I've got this guy, you might be interested. He does protein and muscle work. His name is Mark Tarnopolsky. He's actually an MD, or he's finished his MD degree, and he's doing his PhD, and he's working part-time in the IC. Because Mark operates on a different level. He lives life at 1,000 miles an hour. And she said, would you be interested? He does protein metabolism in athletes. And I was like, this is too good to be true, right? Fast forward to a few months, and I met Mark. I had broke my leg again. I know it seems impossible, but playing rugby, go figure. And I walked into a lab, and Mark had actually broken his neck, believe it or not. He had hit a moose I know this is a bizarre story, but and the moose, yeah, I know people have seen moose, but they're pretty big. Small car hits big moose. Moose just falls on top of small car, compressed the roof, and it fractured a spinal process. I think around six in Mark's neck. He had a halo on. He was riding a stationary bike with a halo on. I come limping in, and he said, "Oh, you must be Stu Phillips." I'm like, "You must be Mark Tarnopolsky." That was, I think that was, it's coming up on 40 years ago now, but he without a doubt is part of a big reason I'm in science and doing muscle. He made me love muscle. He made me love science a whole lot more. And he's been a good friend and colleague, for, yeah, close to 40 years now.
What an epic first meeting.
I know. And I've told that story before, and people were like, he had a halo on. And I'm like, yeah, he did. And they go, and he was riding a bike. I'm like, yeah. Clearly you don't know Mark, but if you've met him, like, like people who know him are not surprised by that story at all. And I think, as people who have collected fractured bones in various locations, Mark has probably broken more bones through cycling and trail running and doing all of the crazy things that he does, in addition to being a top flight neurologist and metabolic disease specialist and running the neurometabolic disease clinic and an amazing research lab. But he manages to break bones that I'm like, how did you do that? But yeah, so still a good friend, still a great colleague. Yeah, amazing to have friends and colleagues like that. Starting to slow down a little bit now.
He is.
Yeah, he
I don't
talks
know.
about retirement.
Okay.
When it happens, and when it happens, I'll believe it, but we'll see.
Amazing. Okay, so now fast forward, like you said, 4 decades, and you're chairing the department, you're running PACE, you're leading this world-class lab. It's packed full of grad students and postdocs, and what's that like now? A day in the life of like this tension between kind of being the front runner, doing that cutting edge communication, while ensuring the cutting edge, I guess, methodology and experimentation development. What's that journey been like to grow as an academic? And what do you have on the horizon today that's most exciting?
Yeah, lots to unpack there, but I'd be honest. I mean, so 28 years now at McMaster for me, 30 plus years doing muscle and everything else like that. A lot in the early part of my career was about me. It was about me and my reputation and getting papers out and everything. You begin to evolve. You're taking on your first couple of grad students, and you begin to, assume the role of mentor. Never received any formal instruction in mentorship, just kind of picked up the things that I thought were good characteristics in mentors that I had. I'm blessed. Stephanie Atkinson and Duncan McDougall, my first mentors. Mark Tarnopolsky, a guy named Howie Green, a guy named Bob Wolf down in Texas, all had some great characteristics. Every experience I have was very positive. Difficult at times, for sure. That's the nature of science, I think. And you just kind of roll, the characteristics that you think were good ones and, try your best to be the person that motivates the person that you're now supervising. And I guess, still part of it, I think if you spoke to students that I have now, the evolution now is that it's not about me. It's very much about them. I'm more proud of as a marker of what we've achieved, of people who have trained with me, their accomplishments, than I am of, papers are awesome, grants, awesome, all, conference, the whole thing is an amazing journey, but I really care about the people who work with me, and basically the people who I said in the bio, I pay homage to every time I give a talk, because they do the hard work and they make me look good. And I think if you spoke to them, they would probably say, I kind of run things a lot, kind of like a team always. Like everybody helps each other out. There are special people, but nobody's so special that you can't pick up a broom if the floor's dirty or something like that, or help other folks who are going through a tough time or a long research protocol or haven't experienced success in the lab, because it's a grind, right? You and I talked about it, but I think that's life too. But I'm pretty proud of what we've got here. Just great people. For science, the whole answer is about people and collaboration. I'm fond of telling the story that I have lots of folders in my email inbox. It's pretty well organized. although not as organized as my wife's. But the biggest folder, the one that has more folders within the subfolder, is entitled Collaborations. And it's about working with others and making bigger and better discoveries by, doing what we do best, but then working with others that show us how much better we can be. And that's been just an incredible journey to go through with the students for sure.
A couple of things there. You mentioned, sweep the floor. 2 points on sweeping. I think one is, first makes me think of, sounds like somebody, and given your rugby background, sounds like somebody's read Legacy, New Zealand All Blacks, like book on, everyone sweeps the shed, right?
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah. You might be
that's cool.
special,
That's cool.
but not in so special you can't pick up a broom.
That's right. And then on a second point on sweeping, I remember you get to a point in grad school, because it can be really tough. And so you do need great people around you. But, once you there's the beginning, like the ideation phase, which is like, okay, well, primary research, where's the gap? What can I do? How can I serve? What's uniquely me? The talent that is being called out of me in this scenario. And, then applying for the funding and making sure you're getting that all secured. And, then you're like, okay, I think I have a question worth asking. And then you go out and you do the the data gathering, right? And I don't know if it's still this way, and this varies obviously depending on discipline. But the first couple of years was on like data gathering. There were like kind of this iterative loop where I could do kind of mini experiments, but it was all kind of like cycling up to like the big PhD and defense.
Yeah.
We had a great supervisor. Like I had a great supervisor, Stuart Doolittle, who was very much like in grant writing. He gave me a great tip. He's like, write the grant on the research paper you've already written rather than the one you're going to write.
Right. And people who, there's a lot of good ideas and forward thinking. And I've sat on lots of grant review panels now, and I'm fond of saying that a good idea is the entry point, but a good idea plus, and here's a little bit of data, and it's not great all the data, but it's enough to go, somebody goes, oh, they've got a pretty good idea of what they're doing. So write it for what you've done is that's the best grant to get, right? So, I know it sounds like you're sort of perverting the process, but I'm fond of pointing out to people that grant reviews are based on merit for sure, but just remember that you're now playing in a park where everybody's pretty damn good, right? So
that's right.
Sorting out the good from the gooder, from the goodest, ideas. The funding margins are pretty slim.
Yeah. Sort of just the second point on sweeping the floor, it was like, I was done all the data collection and getting my hands dirty, and then you're doing the analysis, and then you're doing the writing, and you just feel like you're going in circles, and it's the home stretch of like defense and everything. And it kind of feels like you're moving a mile a minute, but then also doing nothing because you're in this echo chamber.
Yeah.
Anyway, somebody broke a flask or something, and I was like, oh, let me sweep that up. And I remember sweeping it up, and I was like, man, that feels like the most accomplished I've been in the last 6 months. It's like I actually took something from beginning to end in like 2 minutes. That was amazing.
Wow. Yeah.
And that's like a tough echo chamber you can fall into if you don't have the right culture in the lab, right?
No. Like, and I'm fond to tell spot on. Someday, like the analogy I give to every student is, when they come in and start writing a thesis, maybe as a master's student, and particularly as a PhD student, I'm like, you're Sisyphus pushing the rock up the hill. Like it's always there. Like it's always pushing back against you. And there would, hopefully every day you can push it a little bit, but there will be times when all you can do is roll it sideways. And there will be times when you'll feel like this thing is pushing back on me. Right. And I'm trying, but I can feel myself sliding. And that's, and I always say, if it feels like that, like a lot and a lot of days in a row, you need to come and talk to me. We need to have like an honest dialogue about what's happening or not happening. And I said, but the day, man, you defend that thing, it's like you push that sucker over the hill. And I know that they all, I think when they first hear it, they kind of look at me and go, okay. And at the end they go, I get what you mean.
Yeah.
But I understand exactly what you're talking about.
Well, I mean, figuratively and actually in the realm of resistance training, right? So
it's an even better analogy. Yeah.
Yeah. So, you came in and, think this is going back to our first call, is like, protein was like the be all and end all of the research, I think nutritionally. I'm wondering, how much has that changed? Is there a confluence there with the resistance training? I remember this, like, there's the real science and there's the bro science, I'll get your however many, grams of protein per pound. And I think Tarnopolsky gave me a new number on this, but everything was for a long time, like, well, it even is today in all the marketing stuff, right? Like protein, protein, protein. So like, what's the deal with protein, man? Like,
Yeah,
yeah,
it's odd, right? 30 plus years ago when we first started doing this, I would go to a conference and everything in sport and exercise science was about carbohydrate because it was the fuel. We got muscle biopsy data to show that, glycogen stores go down when you exercise. So that's a stored form of carbohydrate. But it was really it was carbs, carbs, carbs. And then there was a little bit about fat because people were beginning to realize that exercise was good for people with type 2 diabetes. And so it was this sort of lipid, and then obesity was starting to kind of come up. Protein was really, and it was a third place nutrient. Maybe it was even fourth, like alcohol, maybe it trumped it on a few occasions. But, and then, things began to change. Carbs kind of were bad. Sugar was bad. We took it out of foods and, and then kind of fat had a sort of heyday, kind of came back with the Atkins, the new diet revolution, ketogenic diets. And we thought that was good, and then that began to fade. And now protein's in the spotlight. I think it's a little bit of the message that myself and a few others have said. And Mark was saying this a lot of years ago. He still runs some of the landmark papers that we reference and talk about protein requirements for people who are habitually physically active. So athletes for the most part. And they appear to be needing more protein than is recommended by what we call the recommended dietary allowance. Fast forward, almost 30 years, and now people are beginning to pay attention to that message and saying it's probably right. But as with a lot of sort of messages, it gets overcooked, and the marketing extension has been now protein appears in, well, when you've got protein water, things have, gone off the rails a little bit, like protein Pop-Tarts, protein cereal, protein cookies, protein snacks, really, and like so few people, particularly in North America or even globally, and we've got an analysis on that coming out, are protein deficient, like truly deficient. So it's odd that there's this health halo around protein now that I was saying, 10 years ago, I was the heretic calling for more protein. Now I'm like, actually, we're good. We're good with where we're at. Like, twice the recommended dietary allowance, or 1.6 grams of protein per kilo, kind of checks a lot of boxes for a lot of people. 0.7 grams of protein per pound. But now I'm underselling protein, is that, we should be over 2 grams per kilo, and targets even higher than that. Like the more protein you can eat, the better, the better, the better. And so, I 10 years ago, I was the heretic. Now I'm the sort of anti-heretic because I'm calling for a reality check. But most of what we're hearing today is marketing shtick for sure.
Yeah. A note on the fats. And again, I would call it heresy, like, because I'm not in it right now. But I have this sneaking suspicion that we're going to see a resurgence on fat, and I think in a different kind of way, where it's like not all fats are created equal, right?
Oh, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think we went through that a little bit with, like, carbs were good and fat was bad. So we yanked like every kind of fat out of food and we just refilled it with sugar. And that was
Or margarine.
a true injustice of, in the food system for sure. And now it is, the recognition that the devil is in the details. Some fats, not good. Other fats, actually neutral. Other fats, actually quite healthy and health promoting in lots of, nutrition science is an odd science, because there are so many people that eat food, like everybody. Social media has now created, experts in nutrition that have no formal training in nutritional science, So I'll just sort of leave it there and just say that there are a lot of loud voices. But to your point, it wouldn't shock me if fat made a big resurgence again. We're talking about fat and protein. I could handle protein falling out of the spotlight a little bit, to be honest.
Yeah. And what about creatine? Because I think Tarnopolsky did a lot of stuff
Yeah,
there
yeah,
too,
yeah, yeah.
as did you.
Yeah. Creatine is, it's been around for 40 years now. I was privileged to sit in on one of the first lectures that, again, to age myself a little bit, that Eric Holtman, who together with Roger Harris were like the first people to show that as a supplemental compound, it was effective in improving sprint capacity and lots of other things. Mark has been a big proponent of creatine for years. He deals with a lot of patients with mitochondrial diseases, some of them very, very niche. There's like literally a handful of people that have these things and other ones that are a little bit more common, but neuromuscular and neurometabolic diseases, Mark has just about all of his patients on creatine and is a sort of round endorsement now as a supplement that has come and stayed, which puts it in pretty rare category as far as I'm concerned for sports supplements. Creatine does have its benefits for sure. It's been argued by some now recently that it's a semi-essential nutrient, and I think that's taking it sort of a step too far. But the most recent stuff, and maybe you discussed this with Mark, but is its effects on brain and cognitive function. And, everybody's fond of pointing out, well, we don't have a lot of clinical trial data. And I'm fond of pointing out, well, it might be years before we have that. So, it's the supplements that I take. Creatine is one of them because I can't wait for the trial data, and I'm fond of, pointing out when it comes to cognitive decline, dementia, that sort of thing, we have no medication for that. We've got meds for lots of other great chronic, diseases, but we have nothing for, cognitive declines other than lifestyle and a few kind of crummy meds. So I'll take all of the low risk, low cost. And everybody goes, what about this form of creatine? I'm like, the stuff you get at Costco is just as good as the rest of the stuff.
I had a question, statement / I think it'll turn into a question. So this was going back to, I call myself a recovering academic because I was a prof for a while, a couple of years ago before going in the industry. I say that affectionately.
No, that's all good. I understand the humor in the phrase.
Yeah. Okay. So I remember one of the course. So I taught. It's like nutrigenomics and evolutionary biology, and I've had some of the advanced nutrition courses, and I actually wasn't formally trained in nutrition. I was like you, trained as a biochemist, and so you kind of go into like nutrition, and I'm like, it feels like marketing for biochemistry. It's not quite that, but it feels like less technical, let's say, more accessible.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I was blown away by, so a couple of things. So like number one was looking at like iron absorption, and one of the things that leads to better iron absorption is when it's with red meat, there's this like meat factor protein and I'm like, what is that? It's like, we don't know, right? So I'm sure it's advanced since, because this was a decade or so. But then in general, just as you mentioned, like it's hard as heck to do clinical trials with nutrition, and one of the areas that I'm reading on currently is Peter Checkman's systems thinking, systems practice, where it's basically, okay, so it's bringing like, we're stuck in this hard system, and that works for reductionist science, works for like physics, works for some chemistry. But then as soon as you're starting to get into biochemistry, you get into biology, you get into psychology, you get into sociology, you get into economics, and like nutrition is in and up and all around all those things. Like when I think about like nutrition, it's like when I break it down, I'm like, okay, there's nutrition for function. So like I'm the athlete and I'm strict and that's it. And then there's nutrition for like social cohesion, breaking bread, right? And then there's this entertainment. It's like, hey, this can be fun, right? And it would be great if we could kind of harmonize all those three things. That's kind of the pursuit. Let me just dwell for a second here on the function, because, as athletes, I think we're like, oh, wow, this is cool. You can transform your body like in this way. And I've experimented, and I call it like kind of a molecular workout, if you will, playing on microbial or on metabolic versatility, if you will, right? Because, you go and you switch out to all these different diets. I'm not advocating any one of them, but if I go to say standard Canadian, whatever that is, to ketogenic, to carnivore, I'm not saying I do these things, but what I'm saying is like, when you play with the macros, for a particular aim, like a great example is like, okay, I'm going to carbo load for the half marathon that I said I would never run, and I don't. But I mean, I just playing with it. You see bodybuilders do this, right? And they get into their kind of carbohydrate depletion, water loading, and then reverse osmosis through the carbohydrate what's it called, carbo loading. And I remember I did one of those like natural competitions after I had all these injuries, because I was like, I need a goal, and a goal is symmetry. And if I have a deadline, I'll work toward it. And I'd never done one of those like kind of water loading things where
Yeah.
it's like, basically you cut out all of your, and then you put the carbohydrate, and I'm like, oh my God, like it's just like, and it like just doesn't like until like I did the competition. Like again, this is like the fitness ones, like it's about
Yeah.
getting lean
Yeah.
and light. And
Yeah.
but then after, it was like a week after, is that it just kept coming in the muscle, like the carbs when I kept eating. And I was like, oh, this is how they finish cattle, right? Like
Yeah.
that's got to be the cat, right? So, coming back to your glycogen stories. Anyway, my point is that's like a very bizarre use case where on the outside look as a credentialed academic who's doing these, things, with their body. And it's like one thing to kind of do it, I suppose, in the privacy and the controls of your own home and entertainment function, social cohesion, whatever. But, we're moving into this age where, I think you had mentioned it's like, hey, you've got all these folks on social media, self-proclaimed experts, and, you've got everything, like you said protein water, you're hearing things, we talked a little bit about this longevity
Yeah.
revolution. We talked about like this incessant optimization before getting, our houses in order with first principles. So I'd love to hear your stance, somebody who's at the forefront of research, somebody who's living this every day and living in a time and space where there's all this kind of longevity optimization, as you say, like, and now it's just like enhanced at the yin yang with all of the AI seeming and interestingly all sounding the same. And so I'm interested to get your thoughts on what you're seeing and how far have we fallen, and what can we offer our listeners to be like, hey man, like here's, given everything that we just said, like everything insofar as nutrition science is like, I'm not saying it's an oxymoron, but it's research, and they call it research because you research. And so it's like, well, how do I not get overwhelmed and not get pulled into, sharpening the tip of the spear before I've got the sledgehammer, you know what I mean? So what are we seeing? What's wrong? What do we got to correct? And what's like the first principles that we can give to, people who want to integrate a resistance plan for longevity?
Yeah. Like first to comment on research in general. Like I think if you've done it, you get a sense of it's not easy first. And there's a lot of people on social media who are great critics of research, and that's fine. I have no problem with criticism. And they say like, why didn't you do this? And I'm like, well, that would have cost another $150,000. And they're like, how can it cost that much? So I'm like, well, that's what it would cost, because you got to pay somebody, you got to do this, you got to do that, et cetera, et cetera. And they're like, well, just do that next time. And I'm like, well, but you need to get a grant to do that. And they're like, well, just get a grant. And I'm like, yeah, I'll just snap my fingers and get a grant, right? So, if you've not played in the space, it's hard for me to accept you as on social media, my peer, evaluating the research. So, you'll forgive me if I'm trite with some people on social media when they say, oh, you should have done this. And I'm like, yeah, good thing you weren't a peer reviewer. That being said, I mean, I think like a lot of things, we probably should invest a lot more in some really basic science that are trials that are longer than sometimes the 10 or 12 weeks that we get funding to do. There are some big ones that are out there that have had landmark associated health benefits as a result of them. But a lot of what we draw information from in nutritional science is observational. We haven't done the randomized controlled trials that are a de rigueur part of drug testing and drug approval in nutritional science, because it's hard to blind somebody. In some cases, impossible to align somebody to a nutritional intervention. But that being said, we should strive, as hard as we can on the randomization front, and to do as much as we can, as rigorously as we can. But nutrition is tough. So it's a double, I think, toughness that's added to it. Exercise is, by comparison to nutrition is tiny. The funding for exercise research is, it's pennies on the dollar, if that, pennies, less than pennies on the dollar compared to what there is for other types of research. If you compare it to pharma-based research, it's ridiculous how underfunded it is. So lots of people want lots of studies done on lots of things around nutrition and exercise and everything. And it's just not practical to think that you could do a lot of these things. That being said, then the sort of recent kind of co-opting of the longevity buzzword, like even my sons who are in their 20s know longevity, right? And I mean, I wasn't thinking about longevity when I was in my 20s, but I think what most people probably think they want in terms of longevity is actually not what they want. No, I have no interest in living to be 110 and feeling like I'm 110. I have interest in living to be 95 and just going to sleep one night and not waking up and living a full and healthy life for as long as I can for those 95 years that I'm around. So that's health span. That's not longevity. It's different. So being healthy for a longer proportion of your life, because in the last century, we've added 30 plus years to our life expectancy, but we haven't added the commensurate amount of healthy life expectancy. So, most people spend at least a decade or more in some form of reduced health related quality of life because they have one or another of a chronic condition leading towards, the time that they die, all of which, reduce your enjoyment of life, reduce, et cetera, et cetera. So, I think they're two fundamentally different things. But if there are four big, and I mean big, underscore levers that we can point to from randomized controlled trial data, what little there is, observational data, maybe there's a little bit more, but we can't ascribe cause and effect to it. To pull, the primary one is to be physically active. And if you're not physically active, and it doesn't mean you have to go to the gym or be, a gym junkie or do half marathons, or it just means you have to be physically active. So you can't do what a lot of us do, which is spend time sitting in front of screens all day, because that's now, last numbers I'm seeing up to around, 12 to 14 hours a day. And, we humans weren't made to do that. We're not made to sit around. We're made to be physically active, and that can take any form. It can, the base level is walking. At the sort of enhanced level, it's, running and being strategic about what you do. The strength part comes now because we're living longer. And as you live longer, the activities in your life that will limit what it is that you can do. And so we talk about fundamental activities of daily living are almost all strength and power based. So with the final one that we all need to be able to do, which is get up and rise out of a chair, because if you can't do that, you can't get off the toilet and you have to be in assisted living. So, we're beginning to sort of enter this stage of understanding with respect to physical activity and programmed exercise that being strong is probably as important as being, you and I talked about it, ahead of the show, having good aerobic fitness, which we've known for a lot longer, mainly because the focus of the research that's being done was much more heavily slanted towards aerobic work, with the recognition that it was preventive with respect to cardiovascular disease, which used to be the leading killer of Canadians, but is now replaced by cancer, but is also, a big pushback against obesity and cardiometabolic disease and type 2 diabetes. So, aerobic trumps resistance because we know a lot more about it. If you eat well, that's another big lever. And then the other two, and I'm not the qualified person to speak to them, but are sleep and having some form of social connection. And, look around the world, if you believe in Dan Buettner's blue zones, they've taken a bit of a beating lately. They're all places where there's a strong sense of community. People feel cared for. There's a total lack of ageism in the society where people are included in decision-making processes. They're valued, and people sleep well and they keep their stress low. And I was giving a talk just last night, in fact, and I pointed out to people that if you looked at these blue zones, I'd probably want to live to be 95 too, because they're some pretty beautiful places around the world. So might not be Hamilton, Ontario, but you get my point.
That's beautiful. So let me just make sure I got that. So you've got, nutrition, you've got exercise, you've got social, and what was the fourth one?
And then
sleep, right?
So if you haven't mastered those, or if you haven't got at least 3 out of the 4 of those in order, then, don't tell me about time restricted eating or intermittent fasting or, your age-related supplement plan or your blood biomarker panel or your full body MRI scan that you get done every year or, et cetera, right? Because, without the big levers pulled all of the optimization strategies that occupy such a large part of social media hype and shtick and marketing, are so deep in the margins that it's hardly worth even bothering about them for most mere mortals.
So yeah, why do you think that is? Like what is going on?
Yeah, I think I mean, again, not to be overly jaded, but I think social media has created a niche for people to sell themselves as purveyors of information. It's like people talk about the democratization of information. You don't need to go to school anymore. You can just learn it off. And I'm fully agree that that's probably true, but the doing of things has a much greater influence on your understanding than just reading about them is my main point. But at the same time, it's created a shtick for people to sell stuff and market, fringe things that are part of, couched in I'm going to change your life and I'm going to improve your health. And, each little detail is, there's a secret that nobody's telling you, or they got it wrong all along. And, that's the John Hofferism of, the beginning of a mass movement, is to convince everybody that actually they got it wrong. We've been wrong all along. And here's the antithesis or antithesis of that. And I'm going to share that secret with you. And to share that secret, you need to subscribe on Patreon, follow me, follow my program, and I'll give you and then it's a supplement stack, right? And
Right.
really, yeah, like it says nothing about, were you sleeping well? Were you keeping your stress low? Were you physically active? Were you eating well? Are you, is your blood pressure in check? Is you, and these sorts of things. They're the base of the pyramid, and or the four legs of the stool. Try to convince people, and the rest is just, it's like tiny little, it's the fine tuning at the volume knob, if you like.
I like what you said there. I'm just saying this out loud, so I remind myself to put a pin in this, but the social cohesion and the lack of ageism, as you had mentioned, in the blue zones, where, I kind of see that now where I'm doing some consulting in like the AI space, and like in particular, like, how are we bringing AI into, innovation? And it's isolating, I think. Like, it's like, who's using it? And I haven't done the research yet. At this point is, like I said, it's for me to put a pin in and do it like more intentionally later on. But I'll tell you the thing I'm excited about with respect to AI is like, you can now do, here, a practical use case is when I built out Athletigen previously. So that was really a mission behind, like, I was an athlete who accrued way more injuries than he had to. And if I had known some information about my DNA, maybe I might have made some decisions differently so far as my injury predisposition. And so, my thinking was like, hey, if you can give this information, get this in the right hands, like maybe this affects the training strategy on training duration, intensity, and density, because not all athletes are the same. And, one interesting thing in my research on genetics is where you really see, call it heritability happening, is the more extreme ends of the population. Rare disease, elite athletes, it's everything. And it's not least or not most, but it is. You cannot discount genetics when you're standing on the start line of, the 100 meters, for example. Like, there's something clearly different that's going on there.
Yeah.
And I've seen it up close with the molecules. And so anyway, the point is, like, just to kind of get that proof of concept to market and in front of coaches' hands, educated, all that, it's about $2 million in 18 months,
at least.
And but now it's like I look at it in hindsight and I'm like, this is absurd, is, I priced it. I was like, I could build the same thing in probably 6 to 8 weeks, 12 tops, for under $6,000.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, yeah, but now I know the questions to ask, and I've made all the mistakes. It's like you kind of go through in the trial by fire, you're forged in the fire, so to speak. So, and like, who are the more likely, kind of stewards of this kind of information? Who would the better stewards be? Anyway, but something that came out as, so what a big price differential, right? Let's call it 2 million, and I can get it done for, let's just say, under 20,000. So that's pretty cool. So how can you use AI? So I'm excited because I think you can use AI to do things that could normally only be done at scale because you couldn't get the funding from the people who, expected to see the ROI, right? Because you didn't need all, right? And so now it's like, It's like developing drugs for obscure disease where there's no market for the drug companies, right? They're like, why are we going to cure rare disease? That's really got 100 customers. We're going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars doing that. And so what's really exciting is there is like the economy of scale. And so when you mention these four things like nutrition, exercise, social cohesion, and the sleep, it's like, okay, cool. What tools could we create to minimize the friction that seems to be getting in between people achieving those things, right?
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah.
So
No, no.
that's, yeah.
I mean, I think, living in the city that I do, it's probably, there's another layer to this that is harder to unwrap. And that is that, from one end of Hamilton, where I live in the Southwest with the university right here, and the other end of Hamilton, where there are two steel mills, and it's a difference of about 10 kilometers. And yet the difference in life expectancy in certain neighborhoods in the northeast end of Hamilton, where I live, is as much as 15 years. And so, the major difference about those neighborhoods and where I live is socioeconomic status as well. So it's not, lost on me that winning the birth lottery, we talked about genetics, right? So pick your mom and dad wisely, but winning the birth lottery with respect to being born in the right place and at the right time and that sort of thing probably is the layer over top of all of this that is maybe tough to unpack. But from an AI perspective, you know, we've got agentic models now to be able to probably, you know, begin to peel back some of the barriers, if that's the right word, to some of the things that you're talking about. But there's still a basic problem that needs to be solved, and that is to, it is, and forgive my bleeding liberal heart, you know, uh, like an income gap. The idea that people can break out of poverty being, you can just do it. And I'm like, that's absolute rubbish. So, we've got a few other things to solve before we probably, but, and again, the levers for those people living in lower socioeconomic status neighborhoods and higher proportion of immigrants, higher proportion of older people, et cetera, are still the same. The difference is the barriers they would have to opportunity. And, maybe there's an AI solution in there, but I do think there's a material barrier that needs to get solved, if you like, before we can begin to sort of think about some of the real barriers to it. But for people who have the means, I think a lot of people have seen some very powerful drugs come and stay, statins being one, GLP receptor antagonists being another, that people are convinced will just begin to peel all of these things back to the point where you can just drug yourself or supplement yourself into health. But I don't think that's true, because nothing, and I underscore nothing, mimics what exercise does. And so that's that's probably why I think it's number one, and physical activity, rolled in there as well.
Well, so you led me there to the GLP-1 revolution that's happening right now. So like, I mean, you're not just losing fat when you're losing weight, right?
No, no, no.
And you're definitely not building the habits that create those outcomes as byproducts of the behavior change, which are more likely to be sustainable. I mean, if you had a crystal ball, how's this going to end, Stu?
Yeah. The optimist in me, the glass is half full, says that a lot of people who have the means and, knowing that generics will come in Canada for semaglutide this year, so the cost will drop drastically. You're going to see a lot more people on these drugs. It says that the taking of these drugs, which are remarkably effective at suppressing appetite and alleviating hunger and there's side effects and everything else like that, will be the epiphany moment for some people who have struggled with body weight for a long period of time, for them to be able to, and give them some agency over their ability to be able to manage other life decisions, like being physically active, like making better decisions around eating. And who knows, that's the glass is half full side of things. The glass is half empty side of things is just, screw it. I'm just going to take the drugs. I don't really care. I'm losing weight. That's great. That's all I really care about. But as you point out, some of the weight that you lose, in fact, the evidence would suggest maybe a larger than normal proportion of the weight that you lose is muscle. And then if you're like most people, after about a year or two on these drugs, you want to stop taking them. because you've achieved your weight. And so now you're down at this nadir in terms of body weight. And you're like, I want to get off because I don't like the nausea. I don't like the GI effects. I don't like a lot of people talk about their life being beige when they're on these drugs, is that they've lost a little bit of the pleasure that food brings. Like they'll take a holiday from the drugs if they've got a birthday coming up, or a holiday so that they can eat, which is, I think that's a little bit of a cruel irony in there, is that there was something pleasurable, albeit not good, about being able to eat what you wanted when you wanted. But a lot of these people will regain the weight because we know that's what happens when you stop taking the drugs. And what you regain will not be muscle, or at least it won't be if you're probably, 45, 50 plus, or if you're not doing some form of exercise. So in that case, I think it could be, a not particularly good long-term outcome, not to mention bone, which could also be more vulnerable as well.
You mentioned living beige. I've read anecdotes of couples going on, getting fitter, looking better, but not being desired by the other.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's an
There's sort of an
irony.
anhedonic state where people kind of flatten out on, not everybody. Yeah, it's not, I would say it's common, but it does occur to varying degrees in people. So yeah, they lose sexual desire, sexual appetite. They lose pleasure in life for lots of things. But, the other side of that, the glass is half full, is that people find it easier to stop drinking alcohol.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that might be a win for some people. Find it easier to stop smoking. And, all of that makes me think, well, I don't know, maybe there's an upside to some of that, but it's a complete sort of flattening of, your affect of just about anything in life. That's probably not a good thing either.
Well, let's change gears to the more of that glass of full and the pace stuff that you've been doing. Let's talk about John there. And how do we make more Johns? And because that was like, a member of like 500 or so, right? And like, what's the future of pace? And how do we make that like 500,000, 5 million in all month?
I wish we could bottle up what we have in pace. I mean, I without, giving anybody more than a thumbnail sketch, because that's all I can give you, So PACE is a community access facility that's run out of our department. So 2 floors down and about a 3-minute walk in that direction. 500 community members come in. Some of them are part of research studies. Others just come in to exercise. The whole facility runs on the backs of about 150 volunteers who donate on average about 30,000 volunteer hours a year. It's the equivalent of about 18 full-time positions. I think it's actually part of the secret sauce. The members who come in interact with younger people. There's an intergenerational flow of energy, dialogue, mojo, call it whatever you want. People experience a degree of social connection through that, probably or almost assuredly a degree of social support for the activity that they're undertaking. Some of the folks that we have in there, we have a big cohort of multiple sclerosis patients, people with spinal cord injuries who often talk about social isolation. And then to be able to come into this, it's just a very vibrant place. And you just can't help it with young, enthusiastic university students who genuinely care about the people that sometimes they know they're just talking to. They might be pedaling on the bike. There's hardly any resistance on there, but they're having a conversation about a sport game that they watched last night, hockey, baseball, whatever, somebody's grandkids or something. And that probably, the exercise physiologist wants to say that it's the exercise, but I live under no illusion that it's probably the conversation as much and the social connection that they experience that's a big part of it. So it's a very welcoming, positive environment that, I'm proud to have ever been part of. But I don't know how you bottle that up and kind of keep it going. Part of it is there's a woman named Linda Freed. She lends her name to, it's called the Freed Frailty Index. And she came up with a program. She works out of the Washington, D.C. area for older people to be volunteers and to connect within the community through volunteering and doing other activities. But Intergenerational connections are particularly important. Young people visiting older people, older people visiting younger people, that sort of thing that she thinks are sort of kind of the lifeblood of getting people to be engaged and not lose a sense of purpose in who they are. I'd like to say it's all like John, who we spoke about, when John turned 100, we gave him a free membership. We probably should have given it to him earlier, but then every time he would see me when he would come in when he was 101, 102, 103, he'd be like, still use that free membership. I don't think at the end, John did much exercise, but he talked to people for a solid, at least half hour, 45 minutes. And I wish I could tell you there was something that John did that we could all do. There's the characteristic of these super agers. And if they do have one in common, I don't know what it is, because John worked as a prison guard. He ate oatmeal every morning. He drank red wine until the day he died. So, I don't know, but he was a much loved and cared for guy. And yeah, an inspiration. And he was active, up until I would say sort of 100 and probably 2 to 3. And then there was a lot more talking that went on.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you said it, right? Like we've evolved to move and we've evolved to be like social beings, right? And meaning making is like a lot to do with our relationships and relationship building and relationship maintenance. And so, well, what is the status of PACE currently? So is that still active?
Yeah, still ongoing. It's under the direction now of Dr. Jennifer Heiss. I'm the chair of the department. PACE runs its own show down there. And it's onwards and upwards. I'd like to be able to say that, we could amplify PACE's effect. I think it's a model. It's a living lab to me of sort of a social / physical / cognitive. Dr. Heiss is has a neurocognitive background, so she's injected a lot more around the brain health side of things into what goes on down there, which I think is again if you talk to folks who are in PACE and I say to them, what is it that you fear as you get old? And nobody talks about death. Everybody knows that that's going to happen. But they talk about the fear of dementia, of not knowing their own mind, to use their words. And then the fear of being dependent on somebody. And that's physical dependence. And, that's really a function then of being cardiovascular, heart and lung, and muscularly fit. And I don't think that you need to be at the top of the heap. I just think really where you don't want to be is at the bottom. So if you're in the third quartile or the second quartile, you're still way better off than the bottom quartile. Like, by all means, like who doesn't want to finish first? But really the message is like, don't finish last. And I know that that's not a particularly motivating message, but that's where all the data is comparing number 1 to number 4, number 1 to number 5. In terms of quartiles, quintiles. And it's always the bottom quartile, quintile, tertile, whatever, that does the worst. And by worst, like a long way worse.
So the beginning of our chat, we talked about the kind of recent successes of your lab. And, it's kind of busting at the seams. And, what are you looking forward to in, let's say the next, if you're going to hit your 95, 35 years, right? That's a lot of life, right?
Yeah, I got some life left to live. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So like, what's the future look like? The legacy of your lab, and
yeah, I mean,
what's
yeah.
I was just saying, what's the key takeaway we want to leave listeners here with today?
Yeah, I mean, there's probably two. I've become very focused on aging well. I think research becomes me search, right? But seeing people model what it means to age well has inspired me to, what does that mean? We have a very generous donor here at the university in Suzanne Labarge, who established the McMaster Institute for Research on Aging. And that's been a real, sort of epiphany moment for me to be able to participate in meetings with other scientists that are interested in aging, but talk about it from entirely different perspectives. I don't know that the Stu Phillips 5 years ago, before this was a reality, would have ever mentioned socioeconomic status as a big driver of people's ability to age well. But that's been a realization that hanging out with other people and listening to the messages that they delivered and being part of research programs where I thought I was going to lead a project. And then the discussion happened and it turned out to be something entirely different. And I was like, I can't lead this because I don't know what you're talking about. So, lots of evolution of my understanding in that area. But I do think that, as a stamp that I would like to kind of leave and walk away is that, we emphasize the importance of being stronger as you get older, as being a key part of aging well. And so that's the kinesiology in me, and probably the rugby player from way back, is that strength is going to matter at some point in your life, and probably a lot more than you think. And you need to begin to pay attention to that earlier. We're trying to do all the omic stuff as well. Not that I'm unexcited about that, but a lot of it I just don't understand, to be honest with you. So I'll have to get younger, brighter people to explain it to me. But maybe there'll be a discovery there that we have no idea what it will be, because, who can anticipate what some of these things will show? So, yeah. And as you said, in the early days, you'd sequence a gene, you get a paper. And then
That's right.
you were around when the whole genome was being sequenced.
Yeah.
And now we can characterize ohms of ohms. And, the integrated data that AI, I think, will help us unlock and solve with multiple omic integration may reveal things that we have no idea what they will be, because we can't even comprehend the volume of the data. But it will be in the integration of these things that I think we may get some pretty incredible discoveries.
Amazing. One final question I ask my guests is, who should join the conversation? Who would you recommend as my next guest?
Good question. Wow. I think that, I think that there's a role for listening to somebody who is sort of a social geographer and understands a little bit about, the barrier. My eyes have been opened on this sort of economic and social disparity as a big driver. We can talk about, people are fond of presenting in my field the association between strength and all of these sorts of outcomes. But if you want, literally one of the strongest predictors that you could put into a model that would predict how long people will live, it's household income. And, you can't escape that. No amount of bashing that in whatever way you want. And so, there's a few people who have taught me things, and late in life taught me things, not things that I grew into, I've been forced to consider. They were not things that were on my radar.
Any one person that you could recommend?
There's probably a few. Before I give their names, I'll definitely check it out with them, but
Okay.
I'll pass it on to them. I have a couple of colleagues over in the School of Earth, Environment, and Society, which is what they call, I don't want to be pejorative, but geography and geology these days, but
Sure.
they do social geography, and there's people who do social, health disparities, et cetera.
Okay. I'll circle back with you.
Yeah.
And, on that conversation, but for today, let's wrap it. Stu, Dr. Phillips, I want to thank you so much for taking the time, for all that you have done, are doing, and certainly are set up to do. Yeah, great to have you. Thank you. Stu said something that really stuck with me after this episode. He used to think about resistance training as something athletes do, and now he thinks about it as something that, hey, mere mortals actually need. Because the last fundamental act of independence isn't about squatting 500 pounds. It, interestingly enough, might be rising out of a chair. And if you can't do that, you can't do some of the most basic private things like getting off the toilet. And then you're in assisted living, and that's the line. So, but what really landed when I think about our conversation were these 4 pillars that he painted out just so simply. Move your body, eat real food, sleep well, and stay connected to people. Master those before you even start thinking about optimizing. Because without the fundamentals, what we discussed is it really just might be putting lipstick on a pig. So there's DNA in our cells and there's DNA in our choices. And what Stu showed us today is that strength isn't just a muscle property, it's a life practice. And the strongest version of yourself might just be the one that shows up, picks up the broom, and stays in the conversation. Thanks so much for joining us this week. I hope to see you again next week on the DNA of Things.